The Yiddish language as we know it today is a direct consequence of the Black Death. While the plague spared no community, observers in the Holy Roman Empire noticed that Jews seemed to die from the disease in slightly lower proportions than Christians. We understand today that this is because Jews in that part of Europe were more likely to regularly wash their hands than their Christian neighbors. But at the time, this encouraged rumors that the Jewish population was somehow causing the plague. This also played into the centuries-long power struggle between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope, and as the Pope at the time defended the Jews against these accusations, the Holy Roman Emperor Karl IV actively encouraged his subjects to murder their Jewish neighbors in order for him to take control of their assets. Suffice it to say that in a shockingly short period, tens of thousands of Jews were massacred, and while most of the survivors fled to Spain, a small contingent of about 350 fled into Poland, where King Kazimierz III offered them protection. These 350 refugees are the ancestors of all Ashkenazi Jews today, and one thing they brought to Poland with them was their dialect of medieval High German, which incorporated large amounts of Hebrew vocabulary and was written using the Hebrew alphabet. Over the following generations, as the community began returning to the Holy Roman Empire, they discovered that the massive demographic shifts caused by the Black Death had led the German language to evolve so dramatically and so suddenly that the Jewish dialect had effectively become a separate language, Yiddish. But even up to the present day, there are people who are uncomfortable with the idea that Yiddish is a separate language rather than a German dialect, and this was even more common in the past. Have you ever heard the saying, "A language is a dialect with an army and a navy"? That's actually a Yiddish saying, and it's a definition of language that Yiddish has never met. Even in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Hebrew was the sole official Jewish language, because that was the language used in the Jewish legal system. If people couldn't even reach a consensus that Yiddish was a language in the first place, you can probably guess that it wasn't generally well respected. Over just a couple generations in the late 18th and early 19th century, the Western dialects of Yiddish went completely extinct, as the emergence of the Jewish Enlightenment instead promoted the revival of Hebrew and the embrace of local languages shared between Jews and their Gentile neighbors. There were occasional surges of Yiddish literature in the East, and of course Yiddish has always been the primary language of Hasidic Judaism, but Hebrew was always the primary language of law and religion. But there was a problem with that, and one that we see everywhere in the Jewish world at this time. Because Hebrew remained the language of law and religion, its use was almost totally limited to those who studied law and religion, educated, usually middle-class men. Even as Hebrew underwent a literary revival in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the vast majority of Jews lacked proficiency in it due to their class or gender. Now, that was about to change very quickly, but in the 1870s nobody knew that, so Yiddish-speaking poets, playwrights, and novelists increasingly turned to their own language as a vessel for reaching the masses. I worry that I'm making this sound very political, but it wasn't seen that way at the time. The embrace of Yiddish in this way was very much a practical decision. And anyway, this video isn't actually about Yiddish. The history of Jews in Romania began at some point. It's unclear when. There's a reason I haven't made a video about it until now, as Jews in medieval and early modern Romania were not particularly numerous or influential. One thing we can say is that when the Polish governor of Moldavia, Roman I, established the city that bore his name in the early 1390s, there were Jews living there. These were Romaniote Jews, that is to say, the descendants of Hellenistic Jews who spoke a derivation of Greek called Yevanic and came north as traders from Greece and Anatolia. Virtually all of the patronage of Jewish traders in Moldavia, and to a lesser extent Wallachia, came from Polish and later Ottoman overlords, as well as the local aristocracy, the boyars, who used the Jewish population to facilitate commerce and manage their vast estates, much in the same way as in Poland. But unlike in Poland, there wasn't a big constitutional culture built around that toleration. So virtually any conflict involving the two principalities made Jews easy targets for both the peasantry and the princes. So if you've ever wondered about Vlad the Impaler's Jewish policy, rest assured, it was identical to his Ottoman policy. Vlad was an extreme example, but the odds were likely that any Wallachian prince could sanction the mass slaughter, mass ransoming, or forced conversion of Jews in cities like Bucharest at a moment's notice. Even Sephardic refugees who came to Wallachia in the 16th century quickly discovered that its status as an Ottoman vassal didn't protect them. Moldavia was slightly better, but only in that the murders and extortions weren't as frequent or large-scale as in Wallachia, mainly because they were usually the work of invading Russian armies or local troublemakers. Sometimes it did come from the top, but in most cases, the perpetrators were eventually caught and punished. Additionally, Jews faced far more economic freedom in Moldavia than in Wallachia, which is why, when thousands of Jews began fleeing the partitions of Poland to the north, they almost exclusively resettled in Moldavia. With the arrival of nationalism in the 19th century, the differences between these two states would define the Jewish role in Romania going forward, but not in the way you'd expect. In 1821, Wallachia became host to the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence, due to its large Greek diaspora population. Sadly, Jews were heavily targeted by Greek patriots because of their cultural association with the Ottomans and the heavy religious influence of the movement. But precisely because of that uprising, the principalities spent decades under a supposedly protective occupation by Greece's ally, Russia, whose severe racial apartheid policies known as Russification gave Romanian nationalists an entirely new ideology to fight against. So when the revolutions of 1848 broke out, a coalition of liberals issued the Declaration of Islas, which not only proclaimed the establishment of an independent, united Romania, but also demanded the promulgation of equal rights for all citizens, the equal education of women, and the emancipation of Roma, Muslims, and Jews. And Jews were no longer passive figures in Romanian politics. Among the revolutionaries were the Jewish-born artist Constantine Daniel Rosenthal and the so-called Mendelssohn of Romania, Dr. Iuliu Barasch. But it was politics that would doom the program of emancipation. Like most of the revolutions of 1848, the Wallachian uprising was crushed, in this case by a Russian invasion. And while the seeds of nationalist politics had been planted, it turned out to be far less ideologically principled than the original core of revolutionaries had hoped. The outbreak of the Crimean War, which saw the principalities once more subjected to Russian invasion, renewed the revolutionary spirit. And sure enough, the Treaty of Paris that ended the war guaranteed the establishment of Romanian self-governments and liberalization under Ottoman suzerainty and the direct supervision of the European powers. Before the end of the year, both principalities had abolished slavery among the Roma people, as well as the aristocratic privileges of the boyars, but attempts at Jewish emancipation once again failed. By this time, the divide over Jewish rights wasn't between liberals or conservatives, or unionists versus separatists, but between Moldavia and Wallachia. Moldavia was a much poorer, more rural country, and one in which the Jewish population was not only many times larger, but fulfilled a specific societal role that was emblematic of the antiquated feudal system that liberals and nationalists sought to eradicate. Even in Wallachia, Jewish emancipation wasn't something all the revolutionaries agreed on, but in Moldavia, it was outright counter-revolutionary. In their eyes, the Jews held a monopoly on the middle class, and Romanian prosperity was conditional on Jewish suffering. Despite the accession of the more liberal prince Alexandru Ioan Cuza, who vocally supported unconditional Jewish emancipation throughout his reign, most politicians, even those who had once shared Cuza's aims, like Prime Minister Mihail Kogolnicianu, now positioned themselves as arbiters of a compromised, conditional emancipation. In order to be considered for citizenship, they argued, Jewish religious institutions needed to be reformed so that they were no longer a feudal estate of the realm, specifically through the abandonment of traditional dress, adoption of the Romanian language, enrollment in public schools, and enlistment in the military. Now, for masculine like Barasch, this was great news. An ever-growing share of the Jewish population was already thoroughly opposed to the old way of doing things, and these new opportunities were especially welcomed by the younger generations. But outside of the Jewish community, Kogolnicianu's conditions for emancipation only encouraged more mob violence under the guise of aiding Jewish modernization. The growing momentum against the Jews reached a tipping point in 1866, when opposition figures deposed Cuza and installed a Prussian prince on the throne. This in turn stoked a xenophobic panic that a foreign-born ruler would elevate the position of other foreigners, especially Jews. In the midst of their effort to create a new constitution, Finance Minister Ion Brătianu and Minister of Religion and Public Instruction C.A. Rossetti proposed scrapping all religious requirements for citizenship and allowing Jews to apply for naturalization after a period of 10 years. But news of this proposal triggered pogroms all over the country, including a smattering of massacres and the destruction of the Grand Carol Synagogue in Bucharest. Rest assured, both Adolf Kremia and Moses Montefiore led missions and demonstrations in protests of these actions. But the main response by Romanian Jews was to discourage discussion about emancipation for fear of provoking more violence. When the dust settled, Romania had a new constitution that extended rights further than ever, except to non-Christians. Turning away from his support for Jewish emancipation, Ion Brătianu and his National Liberal Party began to champion universal emancipation for all males except Jews, and even began searching through medieval and early modern records for old anti-Jewish laws that could be newly enforced. Meanwhile, in opposition, the Free and Independent faction complained that Brătianu wasn't persecuting the Jews enough. For what it's worth, foreign observers strongly suspected that most of Romania's political factions at this time were being semi-covertly bankrolled by the Russian government, and that the move against the Jews was a direct extension of that sponsorship. Until this point, the great powers supposedly entrusted with overseeing Romania's transition to self-government hadn't made much of an effort to speak out. To the contrary, the loudest voice in support of Romania's Jews by far was the United States. Across the Atlantic, President Ulysses S. Grant sought to make up for his effort to expel Jews from the American South as a general in the Civil War. If ever there was a place for Grant to redeem himself, it was Romania, and he made that effort explicit when he appointed Jewish lawyer Benjamin Franklin Peixoto to serve as the new U.S. consul in Bucharest.
Mr. Peixoto has undertaken the duties of his present office more as a missionary work for the benefit of the people who are laboring under severe oppression than for any benefits to accrue to himself, a work which all good citizens will wish him the greatest success in. The United States, knowing no distinction of her own citizens on account of religion or nativity, naturally believe in a civilization the world over which will secure the same universal liberal views.
Peixoto's appointment was an unambiguous shot across the bow. His very presence in the country, and the fact that Romanian authorities were obliged to treat him as an equal, was credited by local Jewish leaders for discouraging pogroms. But Peixoto also worked proactively to assist the community in establishing schools and providing legal assistance. It must be said, however, that this was only a temporary solution. Romanian authorities felt that Peixoto had no right whatsoever to criticize their government because the US hadn't been a participant in the Crimean War. And even his American supporters and European allies began to lose faith in him in 1872, when he made an unsanctioned and ideologically problematic proposal to evacuate all 200,000 of Romania's Jews to the US. Late that year, Peixoto attended a conference in Brussels to discuss the idea with representatives of Europe's various Jewish aid societies, and they firmly shot the idea down. Peixoto continued to serve as consul until 1876, perpetually broke and constantly negotiating to protect the Jews from planned attacks. But at the precise moment Peixoto was recalled to the US, everything seemed to change. By June 1876, Serbia and Bulgaria were in open revolt against the Ottoman Empire, soon aided by Montenegro and Russia after the Ottoman army was exposed committing some horrific atrocities. The following year, Romania declared its full independence, and for the third time in less than 60 years, the Ottoman Empire was in an existential crisis. In the preliminary Treaty of San Stefano, Russia pressed the Ottomans to make some gargantuan territorial giveaways, at which point the other European powers woke up from an apparent 22-year coma and freaked out. In truth, every European power wanted some piece of the Ottoman Empire, but they'd much rather have gotten nothing than allow Russian domination of the Balkans. In particular, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli pressured Russia into renegotiating. In lieu of the previous agreement, Bulgaria would be split in two and remain under Ottoman suzerainty. The Ottomans would lose less territory, Austria-Hungary would occupy Bosnia, and the British would gain control of Cyprus. Less well known is Bismarck and Disraeli's other demand, that every country in the region abolish religious requirements for citizenship and emancipate Jews. Greece and the Ottoman Empire had already done so decades earlier, and Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro readily obliged. The Romanian government, however, was not so amenable. While C.A. Rossetti was able to secure a majority of conservatives and some liberals to ratify the treaty, officially overturning Article 7 of the 1866 Constitution, the compromise plan for Jewish emancipation was essentially written to ensure that emancipation would be in name only. Automatic emancipation was offered only to those Jews who had died fighting in Bulgaria. The surviving veterans would have to prove their identification multiple times over to the national government in person. All others would have to undergo a 10-year waiting period and then have their naturalization voted on by Parliament itself on an individual basis. At this time, the Jewish population of Romania was about 229,000, and by the end of the 19th century, the total number of Jews emancipated by Parliament was 83. Over that same period, successive governments issued laws giving themselves the power to restrict Jews from teaching in public schools, attending public schools, practicing law or medicine, selling alcohol or tobacco, working in finance, working in retail, working for the railways, or working in factories above a certain quota. Though Jews were never banned from owning factories, the government knew that doing that would probably actually destroy the economy. As for purely Jewish institutions, new laws were passed to force them to remain open on Saturdays and Jewish holidays and forbid Jewish students from covering their heads while studying. Parliament also gave itself the power to immediately expel any Jew from the country who was suspected of being an objectionable alien, which mostly meant Jewish political activists, journalists, intellectuals, any critic of the government, and anyone with a university degree, the vast majority of whom were native-born, like Rabbi Moses Gaster, who went on to become the Sephardic chief rabbi of the United Kingdom. And those were just the actual laws. Mass evictions of Jews from rural counties were a regular occurrence, as well as random police raids on Jewish homes and businesses. For the first time, Jewish emancipation in a liberal democratic country had incontrovertibly and conclusively failed. So, where do you go from there? Well, the main option was somewhere else. As much as Jewish aid organizations had opposed Peixoto's proposal to evacuate Romania's Jews themselves were actually pretty open to the idea. Even by 1878, thousands had already emigrated. But even if the US made immigration easy, it still came at a cost. Under the system established under President Lincoln, new immigrants either had to pay for their own passage, have a sponsor already living in the US, or pre-sign a US labor contract and borrow against their future earnings. And despite the efforts of Romanian politicians to justify their anti-Semitism under the guise of class warfare, the truth is that the vast majority of Romanian Jews were quite poor. By allowing immigrants to be sponsored, the system did leave the door open for so-called chain migration, which would gradually lower the barriers to entry. But that would take decades. And even then, the US Office of Immigration at New York's Castle Garden just wasn't equipped to process that many immigrants. Doing so would require the establishment of some kind of massive, dedicated immigration factory. That was never going to happen. France and Britain were another option, but while immigration restrictions were basically non-existent in those countries at the time, France still had widespread anti-Semitism, and Britain had the class system. Plus, living standards in both countries were lower than in the United States, while costs of living were higher. The Ottoman Empire may have seemed like a good option. Jews were emancipated there, they could have any job they like, attend the University of Constantinople, and by this time the Zionist movement was in full swing. The first avowedly Zionist organization was actually founded in Romania, and the new village of Zichron Yaakov was co-founded by Rabbi Moses Gaster and populated mostly by Jewish refugees from Romania. But the Ottoman Empire was also economically unstable and collapsing in slow motion. Palestine was especially poor, and while Jews were doing okay in cities like Jaffa and Jerusalem, the Zionist project as a whole seemed to be on the brink of collapse. The situation was similar in Austria-Hungary, and Germany was fully off the table, as it had among the harshest immigration restrictions in Europe and was already actively deporting tens of thousands of illegal Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire. So for the time being, the vast majority of Romanian Jews had nowhere to go. But there was a light in the darkness. In all the attempts to exclude Jews from Romanian society, there was one sector that the authorities never touched. It was low-paying, disreputable, and not seen as important, but it would change the face of Jewish culture forever. Show business. In 1876, Abraham Goldfaden was a downwardly mobile, middle-aged intellectual from Odessa. To say that he'd worked as a Yiddish and Hebrew poet, newspaper publisher, and proto-Zionist would imply that any of those ventures succeeded. They didn't. But he did have his fans, and in 1876, faced with the imminent termination of his latest newspaper in Galicia, he accepted an invitation from a wealthy young dilettante named Isaac Librescu to perform some of his poetry in the city of Iași. Goldfaden gained some popularity doing this, but his sophisticated affect alienated most of the working-class audience, so he began partnering up with a collection of local songwriters, comedians, actors, all-around small-town entertainers, the kind of people who'd perform at weddings and bar mitzvahs, to form the first professional Yiddish-language theater troupe. With the Russo-Turkish War came a large number of Jewish military contractors from Russia, some of whom came from Odessa and knew Goldfaden personally, as well as a surprisingly large number of audience-goers who didn't speak Yiddish at all. In fact, Goldfaden's musicals proved so popular with Jews and Gentiles alike that the troupe very quickly ended up departing Romania and touring the Russian Empire and eventually the United States. Now, theater had been part of Jewish culture since at least the time of Alexander the Great. Every major city in ancient Judea had at least one amphitheater, and that's very much something that the Jewish people carried on in diaspora, but only as a small-scale amateur affair. Like the Yiddish language, it wasn't treated with any sort of importance. However, the emergence in Romania of Yiddish theater as an institution that was at once intrinsically deeply Jewish and traditional, yet simultaneously secular and mainstream, not only appealed to a century of anxiety over the nature of modern Jewishness by the likes of Heinrich Gretz or Moses Hess, but did so in a way that appealed to the masses, who didn't necessarily enjoy the luxury of paying attention to politics or philosophy. And because it emerged in Romania, where the performing arts were virtually the only business in which Jews weren't somehow restricted, and where the struggle and ultimate failure of emancipation placed it center stage in the world of Jewish thought, Yiddish theater mattered in a way that it never otherwise would have. This new industry would continue for decades and spawn a Yiddish literary boom as well. Ironically, because the literary center of Yiddish was in Lithuania, it was the Litvish dialect that would be established as the standard, whereas theater Yiddish was Ukrainish, which was widely viewed as being backward and uneducated. It kinda ended up like country music, where everybody sings in a southern accent even if that isn't how they actually speak. To be sure, there were a lot of things going against this. Anti-Semitism was continuing to rise in Romania, and Yiddish wasn't even spoken by all Jewish communities in Romania. Political activism would continue among Romania's Jews. So would emigration and Zionism and the proliferation of Hebrew. But Yiddish theater served as an accidental rallying point for all of those interests and more. It was the one thing that couldn't be taken away. And that was important, because across the border, the Jews of the Russian Empire were about to experience something far worse than anything in Romania. Special thanks to my patrons, including Matthew von Abo, Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskind, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Oshel Gordon, Serhiy Herasimov, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, and Eric Liederman.